Everyone. Sorry. Welcome, everyone. My name is Carmen Mazzara, and I serve as Executive Director of APSIA, the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs. I'm delighted to welcome you to day 2 of our 2020 Diversity Forum Advisor Workshop. This is the 4th annual workshop that we've held. Usually it's a little different when we're able to gather in person, but I'm so glad that all of you could be here from all over the United States. And I'm particularly glad we could have such great speakers look at this very important topic about why diverse voices are needed in the field of international affairs. Hopefully you all have received the link to download our program for the week. It has the schedule as well as the bios of all of our great speakers that we'll have. So I won't read them for all of you because I hope you've had a chance to download it. If not, it's on the same Eventbrite page where you registered. We will be recording these sessions and adding them to the APSIA YouTube page, so you'll be able to revisit the great wisdom that these ladies will share with us today, as well as pick up the content from the other events for our week. We are also glad to welcome you to a much broader community. As I mentioned, this is the 4th annual advisor workshop, and so we'll be welcoming you to that community, and you'll have the option to really participate and share and benefit from the wisdom of all of the other advisors who've been a part of our workshop. And we'll be exploring how we are of service to advisors at our session on Friday. So I look forward to seeing all of you there and then. I would be remiss if I did not extend an enormous thank you to the sponsors who make this event possible. Their information is also in your packet, but in a particular way, I want to thank the Open Society Foundations, Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School, the Robertson Foundation for Government, Texas A&M's George H.W. Bush School, and the University of California, San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. Without our investors, this week would not be possible, so I really encourage you to learn more about the great things that they are up to. And so now with that, I'm pleased to kick off our conversation today. As I mentioned, I'm not going to read their bios to you, but I'm very pleased to have Dr. Frances Colón, who among many other accomplishments and distinctions is the former Deputy Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State, and Ambassador Harriet Elam-Thomas, who among many other distinctions is currently the Director of Diplomacy Programs at the University of Central Florida. So thank you both so much for being here and welcome. I'd love to jump right in. Dr. Colón, to start with you, the topic is why diverse voices are needed in the field of international affairs. But to begin at the beginning, why are international affairs important? Why should students care about what happens in the rest of the world?
Was that, I go first?
Please, yes, if you'll start.
Okay,
yes.
sure. So I think I'll just frame it in the current context, historic moment we're in, which makes it easier for folks to sort of see how it relates to their own lives. You know, in a moment where our nation is, for example, going through an outbreak of a very contagious disease, going through a pandemic that is ravaging communities, we have the ability to work with other countries to wrap our arms around the crisis. What other countries learn being hit by the pandemic first is useful information for us. Sharing of samples between countries is useful for us to really get a handle on what we are really looking at in terms of the virus and the disease, for example. Our participation together with other countries in the World Health Organization and in other international bodies where we would normally be working hand in hand with others to address this global challenge. That is why, in a very today's context, international affairs are important. Because everything that affects our daily lives, in some way or another, has an angle or a component that is tied to our relationship with the rest of the world, whether it's our public health or whether it's climate change challenges. And of course, I'm using those examples. I'm a scientist by background. That's how I came to the State Department to do science policy work. And for me, the last couple of months have highlighted how important our relationship with the rest of the world is in terms of protecting our own citizens here in the United States and helping them. And so that's why I think international affairs are important. It is because the challenges we're being faced with are large. They require the best and brightest minds at the table, and they require our broad cooperation with others in order to help the entire world really get a handle. And that's what brought me to the State Department. That's what brought me to international affairs back in 2006. And it continues to be why I advocate for science diplomacy, among the many things that I work on still on the outside.
Wonderful. Ambassador Elam-Thomas.
Well, I dare say that having spent 42 years in the business, and during that time, 38 of those years overseas, my goal was to try to turn away from some of the preconceived notions that people around the world had about Americans and women, people of color. And the other was that I wanted to inform and sensitize not only myself, but my colleagues in the Department of State of the importance to be culturally competent in foreign affairs. And every one of us brings with us to any meeting, session, our own unconscious bias. It's there. We've always had it. But I also think of speeches I used to give. I refused to talk about women or people of color in any particular field, and I focused on science and technology, Dr. Colón, because that was something that very few people knew about. So I learned a lot in my research. But we live in a world that is totally interdependent. And Dr. King said in his well-known letter from a Birmingham jail, April 16, 1963, that it really boils down to this, that life is all interrelated. We are caught in this inescapable network of mutuality, tied together in a single garment of destiny. Whatever one does directly affects all indirectly. And before you finish eating your breakfast, lunch, or dinner, you have been in touch with the entire world. Whether it's the coffee you drink, whether it's the soap that you use, whether it's the sponge that came from Greece, whatever, you really have relied on people that you may never meet, but they're from around the world. And I would tell my students as well that if you're working in a laboratory, there is a strong likelihood that many of your colleagues are going to be from somewhere else. So that you need to know what it means in terms of distancing. Well, we're all social distancing these days, but what it means in another culture, or whether there is a body language that does not always give you the eye contact and the shaking of hands and all that sort of thing. But we cannot live in a vacuum, and it's quite obvious that we can't do that when there's something called a pandemic.
And each of you have touched on this a little bit. And I apologize for the technical issues, and we'll see what we can do to help those who can only hear a little bit. But for you personally, what has the work meant to you to be in the field and to be an international affairs practitioner in all of the different ways that each of you have? Ambassador Elam-Thomas, would you kick us off?
Well, for some reason, we Americans think we are the be-all, end-all of everything. And you walk into a traditional culture or a Western industrialized nation's culture, and you find out that you really don't have history as long as theirs. Your country is only then was 200. We were celebrating our 200th anniversary, or 230 years old. We could not compete in terms of traditions, in terms of legacy, with many cultures that we would consider developing. Yes, they may be developing, but they had a history much longer than ours. And for me, it was a comeuppance to go to my first assignment in West Africa and find out that people were not going to give me eye contact. They didn't seem to think very much of how great America was. They quickly let me know that I was a child or had come to a country not as an immigrant, but my ancestors had come on a slave ship. So it really was a very sobering experience. And I learned that the key element was to listen to others, recognize that there were things that you could learn from them and not assume that you knew what they were talking about or you knew what their response might be based on what had been promulgated by media, movies, television, and all of that. So it really was a little difficult for somebody who thought she knew it all at 35, walked into embassies and was going to teach people how to handle issues. And one person said, "You Americans try to democratize everything. You don't understand that I don't sit in a room with a driver." And I think, Carmen, you heard me say this at SAIS. I was a total disaster at one of my first assignments because I invited a driver into the room to get ready for a speaker coming to talk in the Ivory Coast. And it's because I didn't know of the hierarchy that you don't mix apples and oranges. And in a very structured and patriarchal society, you're sure not going to bring the driver. I felt he was bilingual. It was important for him to be there. He was going to pick up the speaker. Well, my both Ivorian and Togolese staff said, "I don't sit in a room with drivers." So I had all kinds of really faux pas that I promised myself I would never make again by the time I had left my first 2 or 3 assignments overseas. Because in each case, I did something that was terribly wrong, and I wrote about them when I was in grad school at Fletcher School, because it really let me know that, again, Americans have to be open, be willing to listen, sit back, and process the information before coming out with a judgment.
Dr. Colón, how about you? I think we've lost your sound, actually. Let's see if we can get you back.
Sorry, yeah. Can you repeat the question?
What has work in the field meant for you?
Yeah. Okay. I think several things. One was the ability to bring my expertise and put it at the service of the United States. So I came to diplomacy as a scientist, wishing to contribute in that space. So it allowed me a platform to interact with other countries and represent not only my country, but the scientific community of my country, but also the Hispanic community. And that made a big difference. You know, and I know we'll probably touch on this more later in terms of what being sitting in multiple spaces means to bringing that into foreign affairs, international affairs. But, you know, I remember a day where I was the head of delegation for a group, and I walked into the room, and it was a negotiation with Latin American countries, and somebody said, hi, welcome. We're waiting for the Americans. And, you know, it doesn't get more clear than that, right? What is the face of America that we show to the world, that represents us in spaces, and that brings in, right? So I was that annoying voice in the room that would commiserate with people of different races and groups. I was that annoying voice in the room that would always say, yes, but the data doesn't say that, or the evidence is this, right? I was the annoying scientist, the annoying Latina, you know. And you start to develop your voice and to figure out where you can be in a space. And I started to figure out how I could do my foreign policy work, but also advocate for advancing minorities in the Foreign Service and in the Civil Service at State Department, and integrating science considerations into high-level dialogues. All of those things were what made the work valuable to me, right? I became eventually the vice president of the Hispanic Employee Affinity Group. And the numbers had not changed since 1972.
No, they haven't.
And I'm sure we can say that in different ways or in similar ways about in leadership positions, the African-American community, and more. And that work was also important to me. I thankfully had mentors at the State Department that allowed me to work on those things alongside, right? I had to stretch myself in 20 different directions, because that's what happens when you're the only minority in a group, that you're asked to be the spokesperson and do your job and do everything perfectly and be the token and do all these things, right? And I had to figure out how to manage my time, but I was also able to speak to domestic audiences about the importance of foreign policy work, the importance of having a Latina doing foreign policy work and doing STEM work at the same time. So the work was valuable to me because of the values of the United States that I was proud of, that we were able to represent, or I was able to represent around the world, but also about what my being there meant for my community. And that is something I'll carry with me forever.
Well, let's get into those questions. For both of you, clearly my guess is there have been times when you've been the only in the room, the only woman, the only African American, the only Latina. How can advisors talk to their students about that? What was that experience for you? And as our advisors go and hopefully encourage their students to move into these spaces where they might be the only, how can they help advise and prepare their students for that possible experience? Ambassador Elam-Thomas, would you share some wisdom?
Well, first of all, just as Dr. Colón said, you can't mimic what you never see. So if you never see anyone who looks like you, why in the world would you even want to look at a career in foreign affairs? For many years, I would walk into a classroom, and this was, well, I taught at Spelman for 6 weeks in 1994. That's a little while ago. And when I left, having paid a courtesy call on their president, she said, "Welcome, Sister Ambassador." This is 1994. I had no clue what was going to happen next, but she must have had, I told Johnetta Cole, a sixth sense. But each time you walk into any one of these rooms as the only person, the one thing that keeps you centered is knowing that you know your portfolio better than anyone else. If you're not prepared, it's going to be difficult. Secondly, there is an important element of having a sense of self and being overly prepared. And I'm sure, Dr. Colón, every time you do something, I said, why did I write all these notes? Or why did I do all this research? These guys come in there and they don't have a note, or they're just doing it off the cuff, and everybody's listening. And then you have an opportunity to throw out one or two bits of wisdom that are verified by facts, and people will sort of do a double take. Or you walk into a room as the desk officer for Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus, and they assume you're the note taker. First of all, you have a skirt on. This is 1983, when women didn't wear pants in the State Department. And you're the only country affairs officer that has 3 countries for which you're responsible. And you speak all the languages. Well, now that's a little odd. And they assume you're there to take notes. So it's kind of fun to be the one who, oh, she really can do that. And it gives you a little sense of, well, I'm glad I made the effort. I put myself through what I'll never put myself through again. But then but you have to be prepared. Then you gain the respect of your male colleagues. I can't say it was always fun, but it probably made me a better officer because I never went into a meeting without having done my homework.
Dr. Colón, how about you? Particularly living in both the STEM world and the diplomacy world. Lost your sound. Yeah, we've lost you again. We appreciate the muting during others' remarks, but let's see. One more time. Never count on technology when you need it. While we are waiting, I will encourage everyone, if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box while we go, and we'll take all of them at the end. Let's try one more time. Nope. Let's give it.
Okay, there we go. I'll agree with the ambassador. I've learned that there are certain expectations when one of us walks into a room of how we will perform or how prepared we'll be or if we really deserve a seat at that table. And I was always over prepared. That's still how I do everything. I was always prepared, and it can be exhausting and tiring too. But it was the way that I was able to walk into the room confidently, sit at that table, say my piece, contribute in a concrete way. You know, I found myself taking on a lot of things in order to prove that I deserved my place there, right? Sometimes we take on a lot more than others take on in order to be in the space, carve out a space. And I think that I have to be honest, I don't think that has changed much in decades and decades. But I do, just like the ambassador said, I did find delight in the slightly wider eyes, the turned head. I found a lot of delight in arriving at an international negotiation and having somebody greet my colleague.
Right. Go right past you.
Walk right past me, even though I was the head of delegation, and walk right past me and say, "Welcome, Dr. Colón," and the person saying, "No, this is Dr. Colón," and processing that for yourself and handling it with grace, but using it as an educational moment. I made my office as when I was deputy director of the Office of Science Advice. I made my office embody the values that I had. My team was diverse. My team had a gender policy. My team had, all of these things laid out, and that's how we approached our work. And if the science advisor was invited to speak on a panel, and it was all male, we declined, and we were explicit about why we were declining. And we would say, however, if you would like ideas of other experts on the topic that are also female, we can send you a list of about 50 to 100 if you'd like. You say it with a smile.
Sure.
But you ensure that your work respectfully embodies your values, because not only when we're the only one do we have to fight for our space and sort of protect that space and show that we deserve to be there, but we also have a role in continuing to change and broaden that space for others, right? And so how you incorporate that into your work from your junior years to your more senior years, where you have more latitude to make changes and be the actual deciding factor, right? Those things that I did towards my final years there, I wouldn't have been able to do my first 2 years. But I still made sure that I was mentoring people coming up behind me, right? And contributing to those affinity groups and finding ways to broaden the space for others.
That's wonderful. As Dr. Colón briefly mentioned, the recent events have disproportionately affected the communities that are served by the advisors on this call. And so I guess, is there something that you would share about why looking at global issues, looking at policy choices is particularly important for the groups that are served, but the students that are served on this call, because we now have seen in such sharp relief, in such laid so clearly, why those perspectives are needed and why those folks are the ones most affected when global cooperation does or doesn't happen, when policy choices are made one way instead of another. Dr. Colón, you're nodding, so I'm going to start with you.
Sure. I mean, I use the example of COVID-19 and the pandemic, and um, African American communities in the United States are disproportionately affected by this pandemic. So are Hispanic communities, and the policy decisions that we make at the national federal level and and in the international sphere have a direct impact on how well we serve those communities. Being from those communities, I make sure to center that when I am speaking about the pandemic, when I am talking about the role of the United States in the international organizations where we would normally be playing a leadership role, where we would be normally bringing our best and brightest to contribute to, for example, the global collaboration underway for a vaccine, an effort that we are not a part of right now. That is that our absence from the global collaboration underway to find a vaccine that is effective and available to everybody is extremely damaging to the world, because we bring a lot of talent, scientific talent, but it is damaging to us. One of the things that happens is that as we all know, if corporate interests are the ones that are in charge of developing a vaccine, if they have the first say as to who gets access, that may not benefit everybody. And in the wide sense of everybody, I'm talking about developing countries. I am talking about our own communities, our own frontline communities. And so there's various ways in which this international presence, our ability to be in those conversations, impacts these communities directly. Take climate change. We exited from the Paris Agreement at a moment where we are seeing the impacts of climate change directly on frontline communities. Which are the communities that are disproportionately affected in terms of public health effects of urban heat islands? It's our frontline minority communities. In terms of access to healthcare, to confront infectious disease through mosquito vectors that increase during global warming, our frontline communities. When you talk about all of the communities that are not able to prepare economically for 2 weeks before a hurricane because they live paycheck to paycheck, but the expectation is just go to the store and buy supplies for 3 weeks and you'll be okay. Which are the communities that are being impacted first when you talk about the impacts of increasing storm intensity from climate change? It's our frontline communities again. And this is why we need to be in the global context at the Paris Agreement, in those conversations. We need to be in the World Health Organization, and we need to be having these conversations to look out for our communities in the U.S.
Ambassador Elam-Thomas.
Well, the other is, as you mentioned, Dr. Colón, the need to recognize that there's so many people from the communities that are always under stress, includes the UK. Those who suffered most from COVID-19 there were from Pakistan, India, from the Caribbean, and yet they were the nurses, they were the frontline health caregivers. We would need to be at least cognizant of the fact that there are reasons why many individuals from those parts of the world are in both the US or Great Britain, because there was a way to get a visa to the United States if you came with a profession that was truly needed. Nursing, medicine, well, that's one absolute way not to have to worry about getting a visa back in the day, and perhaps even now. But the other is that there are conflicts around the world that are not based in or a result of Rome, London, or Paris. They're in non-industrialized, non-Western nations. And I can tell you, I didn't learn anything about Afghanistan when I was in college. I didn't learn a thing about Iraq. I knew nothing to speak of about Latin America or Africa when I was in college. I studied the history of Western civilization. Well, that sure as heck didn't include where the major conflicts lie. And then let's take the other leap. You look at Silicon Valley and you see the major corporations there are run 50%, I'm told, by people from the subcontinent. And I'm not talking about Africa, I'm talking about India, Pakistan. Well, if you don't understand a little about that culture, and if you don't bring people who represent that culture to the table, America will still be at a disadvantage, henceforth and forevermore. I have to tell you, I had to learn to step back and get rid of my own unconscious bias towards a certain look, a certain accent. I'm married to someone from the Caribbean, so I've gotten used to being reminded that the be-all end-all is, they live in London, and I thought, well, that's nice. And when I went to visit them, they all live in what in essence is an immigrant community. They're not down the street from 10 Downing Street. So those things made me far more sensitive to the importance of being knowledgeable about world politics. The current UN ambassador from Afghanistan was a guest in my home for a full week under a program called the Mosaic Program from my college, Simmons. She went to Simmons College in Boston and then to the Fletcher School. And now she's Afghanistan's perm rep to the UN. She can't be more than 38 years old, 39. She taught me more about how fortunate I am, even though I had lived for 11 years on the continent of Africa. When you're in close proximity to someone, you all of a sudden realize there are familiar cultural ties that are important that you didn't even think of when you thought you knew so much about different cultures. The most important thing I would say is that we have to take a step back, open our eyes, and recognize that if we are not globally engaged, we will never be competitive with the rest of the world.
And to build on something you just mentioned, you talked about the importance of interpersonal contact and communication and getting to know those from different countries and different cultures. Are there experiences that you recommend, the advisors on the call recommend to students to build those critical skills and competencies? And I'm going to start with Ambassador Elam-Thomas because I can see that Dr. Colón has kindly muted herself again. So I'll give her a minute to unmute while the ambassador answers.
Well, I was an exchange student when I was a junior in college. And this young woman, you've heard me say before, finds herself in southern France, where I'm accepted in a way that I had never been accepted in Boston, Massachusetts in 1962. And all of a sudden, I had a sense of who I had value. Someone said, the black one, how pretty she is. Well, listen, in 1962, we didn't know what to do with makeup. I was just there, one of 10 exchange students, and the only one who looked like me, weighed 1/3 of what I weigh now, and I was green behind the ears. But all of a sudden, I went to museums. I learned that the students who were from France, still in what was called lycée, and I was in college, knew more about international relations than I did. Because in order to survive in Europe, you've got to speak 4 or 5 languages just to get around. And we could go from state to state to state and never really have to learn another language. They also knew the history of what had happened in World War II, because on their way to and from school, they passed burned out rubble and the devastation that took place during the war. And until September 11th, we didn't have that kind of constant memory of what had transpired. Yeah, the Civil War, we all read about it, but we didn't have the actual physical structures that we passed every day if you lived in New York, as these young men and women in Western Europe and in Germany and France did. So they were far more knowledgeable about my history. Then I learned that the students in Africa knew more about American history than I did. And I thought, well, I guess we better start learning. And I really think that the whole idea, it's going to be harder now, of international exchange, cultural exchange, and educational exchange is critical. All right, people talk about it costs money to do that. And most students from at-risk communities don't have discretionary income. Well, I happen to know, having spent 11 years on IIE's board, there are all kinds of scholarships and fellowships for students. But you need to know who to ask for. There are books that I can certainly recommend to the advisors, which we can do a little later, not just for the students, but for the parents. But the other is parents, most parents of students of color don't understand anything other than being a physician, a dentist, now IT, marketing, business administration. What is international relations all about? What does foreign policy have to do with me? But as Dr. Colón said, of course it does. We live in a world now where we hopefully will be able to find a vaccine for the virus, but we can't do it in isolation. So that, and the parents don't see a return on their investment if we suggest you study international relations. Well, how are they going to find a job? Why am I going to send my child off to Zimbabwe? Well, that's not quite the best place, but say Lagos or to somewhere in East Asia or even Central Asia. No, that really is a stretch. However, you'd be surprised how much we rely on the natural resources from places we can't even pronounce in order to survive.
As I love Central Asia very much, so just a quick plug for that. Dr. Colón, over to you.
Sure.
And if you could actually, also the point about parents that Ambassador Elam-Thomas raised.
Yeah. Well, I think that what's happening right now, which is putting in front of students, leaders in this field, and of course others that have excelled in diplomacy, that are from these communities, is very important so that they can see themselves. I think that's crucial. You are in for a shock when you first walk in and you realize how not represented we are, especially in leadership ranks. So I think that's this role modeling is important. I think that preparing them with communication skills. Yeah. Those are things that are not necessarily emphasized throughout the training, but that I think are important. Especially this, and I'll say this generation that would come in now, they want to make a difference. They want to have a voice. They want to express how these international affairs relate to their lives. And there's so many ways in which they do, obviously, as the ambassador said. So, communication skills, how they learn to write about, communicate about these issues and how they intersect with their own lives. Leadership skills in terms of, what do you do when you walk into a room and you're the only one? How do you really pull up a chair to that table? How do you find your space to make your point? What do you do when you're interrupted at a meeting? All of those things are things that we've sort of let our up and coming leaders kind of figure out along the way through a lot of,
trial
and fail. And I think that we have a lot of wisdom accumulated from folks that have been in the trenches for a while, and that we could make more tangible. I mean, talking about failure from leaders is important so they can see how you overcome and you try again. I would say also being very informed about current events. That is what makes a difference, right? When you can walk into that room and you can jump into that conversation right away because you know what happened yesterday with China, and you know what action has happened in the Hormuz, and that Venezuela is in crisis, and you have a global perspective. And what role the United States plays in that. So, and there's ways to do that, right? There's podcasts now. There's so many ways of staying on top of these things, and they really make a difference for you being able to walk into a room, speak with confidence, join the conversation, and lift your voice and contribute to that. And then at the end of the day, you're contributing to how the U.S. is going to address a global issue, right? That's what we're doing there. And the varying perspectives that our communities bring to that conversation are important. How those conversations are handled with different countries, who is framing the discussion, makes as much of a difference as the substance of it. Who do you want speaking for the U.S.? What value system and what you bring to that in terms of your own personal experience, your cultural experience, the knowledge you bring from being raised in one of these communities, all of that makes a difference in how the U.S. plays internationally.
Wonderful. So now I'm delighted to open it up to the questions that you all are sharing in the chat box. The first one bridges quite nicely off the exchange we just had. We've talked about interpersonal exchange, whether it's through study abroad, or there's lots of opportunities for folks who in their own communities to get international experience. We've talked about the need to be up on the news, to write well, to speak well, and to speak coherently about all the knowledge you have in your head. Are there uncommon skills or characteristics that future-ready leaders are going to need to drive in organizations to adapt or collaborate or excel, especially in disruptive times, as our questioner asks, like these? Again, Dr. Colón, you're smiling, so I'm going to start with you.
I think I was kind of answering that question when I just spoke about leadership skills, finding your voice, learning communications at the beginning, being current affairs ready. Those are things that I think the other thing that I think it seems obvious, but I would always tell my team, if you're sitting at your desk all day long, you're not probably not doing your job, because so much of the work gets done based on relationships and building trust across regions, bureaus, thematic issues, and the people that have experience working on something for a really long time, that have been deployed around the world, and your ability to develop a relationship, learn, incorporate that. I think that trust building and building a strong network of relationships is essential to success in foreign affairs. So the culture of the coffee meeting and getting around to really expose yourself to all that knowledge, I think is very important.
Ambassador Elam-Thomas, other skills you would?
Let me go back to Dr. Colón. You have something that I don't have, and that is you have a language that crosses all cultures, the language of science. So you immediately, when you walk into a room, it doesn't matter what background these individuals may have, there's one thing that unites you, and that is scientific knowledge. So because diplomats don't always have that, some in the field who came under your office, yes, they were trained to be scientists and climate specialists, etc. So someone wanted to know about uncommon skills and characteristics of future ready leaders. One is the willingness to be knowledgeable of a language, because if you can't speak that language, you can't build a credible relationship for the United States with anybody. You can't interact sincerely with someone if there's a third person sitting in the room who is your interpreter, because the tendency is to look at the interpreter, and all of a sudden you break that line of communication. I think 80% of my success in Turkey and Greece was the fact that, one, they weren't expecting me, someone who looked like me, to speak their native tongue. Two, there were many Greeks who were married to Americans married to Greeks who didn't speak Greek as well. No, I don't want to put myself on a pedestal, but I happen to have been exposed to a teacher who put his hand on my shoulder in the Greek language training at FSI, Foreign Service Institute, and said, "We want you to do well." I perceived that as patronizing. I was 42 years old, and that was all I needed. I said, "I'm going to ace this." It wasn't easy, but I decided that he's making an assumption that this woman of color isn't going to be able to learn Greek. And I had to prove him wrong. Having done that and some other things early on in my career, wasn't so hard, but it required discipline. I wasn't 32. I said I was 42. And at 47, I learned Turkish, at which point I can tell all of you counselors and faculty members on this call, I wouldn't do that to my worst enemy. It was worse than Greek. But I met Nelson Mandela 3 weeks before my Turkish exam, and I said, if he could get through 26 and a half years of being in prison and not be angry and come out and speak to a joint session of Congress, I can learn and I can pass this Turkish exam. As a result, I was able to handle a meeting where America had been accused of feeding terrorists, have an apology appear on the front page of a Turkish newspaper, and that following year get promoted into the senior foreign service. So it was worth learning Turkish. But again, I couldn't have the rapport with all of my interlocutors while I was in Turkey or in Greece if I had to have a third person with me all the time as my interpreter. So I've been in touch with people. I served in Turkey from 90 through 94, Greece from 83 to 87. I still am in touch with families there. It's work because it's easier now because you have Skype, we didn't use Zoom so much a year or so ago, but you certainly had Skype and you had other ways to be in touch with the internet. And it allows you to build America's image in the fact of saying, we're not fly by night. We're not here for just 2 years. If you open your heart and soul to me, I will continue to be your steady, steadfast friend. The final comment I'll make is I think being a person of color, the Turks who wanted to be members of the European Union felt that they had a sensitive and understanding ear when they were perceived as being the odd men out. This is again in the early 90s to become members of the EU. They would have been the only non-Christian member of the European Union. And if anyone could understand what it's like to be sort of the odd person out, was somebody who looked like me. And they felt that I could certainly help plead that cause. That was one of the objectives that the embassy had at the time when I was in Turkey, is to help push the Austrians and others who didn't want the Turks to be members of the European Union. All of that, of course, has changed now, but it does let you know that one of the skills is important, and that is to have effective interpersonal skills. You can only feign interest up to a point. People can read through you, and if you're not sincere, they will know it.
So I'm going to skip around just a little bit and ask both of you, how do you see the participation in international affairs from Indigenous students, whether that's in policymaking here in the US or in global affairs? Ambassador Elam-Thomas, now you're nodding, so I get to pick on you first.
Well, we have done such a great job of alienating folks who were here before we even were thought of coming on anybody's slave ship, and took land. In our efforts in terms of the programs that I've been involved with and panels I've been on in the past, including the Pickering and Wrangell panels, we were not able to get over the final hump of a young woman who we thought was going to be one of the first Native Americans in our Foreign Service, one of the first. There were two in my 42 years. I met only 2 Americans, Native Americans, in 42 years. The parents said that she could not leave the reservation. She passed every level of requirement, had a internship with the Boston Globe. I was at the Kennedy School at the time, and it was devastating for us to learn in the final analysis. The parents said, no, she can't leave. We don't want her to leave. So that's one of the elements that I don't know how we can change that, other than have senior members of the Indigenous American community be involved in what we are doing now, selection processes, or even sitting in on this kind of conversation. Because I spent time in Australia, and I sent an article to Australia about things going on in the United States and something that had happened to my niece. And one of the Australian women said, you know, we bring Aboriginal children into the big cities and we train them, and we don't realize what we are doing to that child without understanding where they're coming from. And so I don't know a lot of Americans, minorities, Black, Latino, gay, straight, whatever, is really well schooled in what it is like to grow up on a reservation, other than someone who is in another culture. So we do need to improve significantly in outreach to the professors, colleges, and universities which have large populations of students from Native Americans, who are Native American, right? We haven't done that. We tried. It may be enough, but we shouldn't give up.
And we hope those of you who are at those schools that are on this call, and I know there are some, will take that invitation back to your organization.
I would welcome, and I'd welcome them being in touch with me by email or by phone. Dr. Colón, excuse me.
No, I met very few in my time, 11 years there, and I think there's always been questions about how well our outreach efforts are structured to be at HBCUs, to be at minority serving institutions, to be at tribal colleges, all of those. You know, we do a lot, but the numbers haven't changed. So as a scientist, I would venture to say probably the approach needs to be reevaluated. And you know, being present at a conference of colleges isn't necessarily enough, right?
No.
And so, you know, we are being watched by these potential future diplomats. They are deciding between us and Google.
That's right.
And when they see that we don't center our conversations on defending the rights of indigenous communities around the world in our human rights conversations, they notice. And when they see that indigenous communities in the U.S. were also ravaged by COVID-19 and what we did to increase testing sites and what we did to really provide relief to those communities, all of those connections are made. They're made as policy decisions impact how people view and trust their government, and they affect how you see whether that's a space you want to be in. And so I think that all of those things are important to note. And we definitely, like the ambassador said, we need to improve tremendously in how we reach out, in how we shape our conversations, so that we are striking the right tone with those communities in order for us to be an inviting space, a space where they want to be a part of.
We hope to do that. We strive to do that at APSIA, and we know we fall far short. But I look forward to talking with all of you on Friday about how we can help inject some of that into your campuses. And it looks like both of you have a standing invitation to NSU. So,
I was going to say, could we listen to Friday's session when you do? I need to take a look at your full.
Absolutely. I will send you the information for sure. And I know we're a little short on time, but Dr. Colón in particular, one of the questions I get from advisors as they try to share international affairs broadly defined with their campuses is trying to convince the students who aren't already on the IR track, the poli-sci track, the languages, the more traditional fields, that this is an important issue for them to think of as well. Is there, some people may say, you have a PhD in neuroscience. Why the heck were you at the State Department? Is there some ammunition you might be able to give advisors to help them as they try to make the case to their science students as well as their poli-sci students?
Yeah, I got that question all the time, actually. I thought that my skill set my experiences growing up, bicultural, were particularly useful for the United States. I really believe that, and I thought that there was a space where science wasn't already centered in an important way. I thought that this was a space where likely there were not tons of Puerto Ricans running around the halls of Foggy Bottom, right? And so for me, I would say that it was easy to make connections between my desire to contribute, my view of the world as more than just the U.S. end all be all. I have always viewed my community as part of a larger community, a global community, and making the case for that is right now most difficult, and advisors need to really think about how they do this in a way that strikes the right tone and makes this very real for students. We are seeing a conversation where that is more U.S. centric, and I'll use the term nationalistic in some cases, right? And so how you convey the importance of our role in the world, which is critical for our security, our health, our well-being, the economic progress of our communities, those things can definitely be tied to communities across the United States and to the very real life experiences of folks. And we have a lot of opportunity with what's happening right now, in a broad sense, whether it's politically or health-wise or climate change. There's many of those conversations where we were traditionally viewed in the global sphere as leaders. Many countries waited for us to take the first step on things to then say, oh, okay, I will emulate those democratic values, etc. And that may not be necessarily the case right now.
No, right? Aren't you diplomatic?
Right, and imagine, because we need to center all of our conversations in our moment. We have gone through an extremely hard week here in the United States on racial injustice. How you make that relevant to the moments around the world? How do you speak with authority in this moment? All of that, I think those are opportunities for advisors. I think those are opportunities for folks to say, I want to go in there because I want to represent the U.S. with my value system and show that we are more than systemic racism, which has permeated so many parts of our society. I have things to bring to this conversation and to that discussion with the rest of the world. There's so many ways in which we can make a difference in those conversations to really turn things around, and I think that should be part of it.
You have a question on African countries that I want to quickly comment on, if I may.
Sounds good.
In my career, and in my travels abroad and working with Humphrey programs, etc., I found students who were from the continent of Africa far more knowledgeable as the European students were on international affairs, and their involvement gave me a reason to step back and say, listen, you didn't go to King's College. You didn't go to the Sorbonne. They really know how to teach people to become professional diplomats. Yes, we have the major schools in the United States, but if you've gone to the German or the French or the British schools that really focus on preparing diplomats, they are well trained. And a lot of young men and women from Africa have gone to those schools and come to the United States. Many of the students, of all the students of color I've taught in the 9 years I was teaching at UCF, I had 8 students of color. 7 of them were from either the Caribbean or Africa, because they had to come from somewhere else to the United States. So they had a global perspective that most African Americans born and bred in the United States wouldn't necessarily have. And I have friends who couldn't tell you where Djibouti was, even though I try my level best to educate them every time I'm in their presence, because it's not in their, within their, they can't even perceive where that might be and why it might be important to the United States. So I do think African countries are involved in international relations. Maybe it's because I've served for 11 of the 38 years overseas on the continent of Africa, and then the rest of the time in Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus. However, they are truly knowledgeable, and Americans can learn so much, because when you walk into a president's office and you want them to vote with you on a UN issue, the president of Senegal said to me, Madam Ambassador, I will have to talk to my Africa Union, my regional group. I never thought of that. I didn't realize that, yes, those leaders are going to talk to their cohorts within that region. So why should, because you're what you thought was the 800-pound gorilla, walk in there and get them to vote with you on an issue on human rights at the United Nations? So that, to that question, there is a lot of involvement on the part of African countries in international relations. They also are not happy with how they're referred to in certain instances, and I need not go on and on that, but it is indeed important for us to recognize that we can learn from them as well as share our knowledge. Humility is so important, and I tell all of my students that we cannot win friends and change the minds of people if we go in with a level of arrogance. It's one thing of having self-assuredness, but it's another thing of walking in there and thinking you own it, when in fact you don't.
One more important skill for our students to cultivate. I saw one question looking for resources about bringing speakers in and all of those sorts of things, and we can share some of those tools and resources on Friday, and I'll invite Ambassador Elam-Thomas and Dr. Colón, if they have great tips, to send them to me, and I'll make sure that they get out to all of you for ways that we can continue to bring that perspective and show that visibility of the amazing folks from so many different backgrounds that have gone into the field of international affairs, and how proud we are to have many of them in the APSIA family.
What's the question on speakers? Please tell me that. I don't see the one on speakers, international speakers, or what.
Our colleague, I believe Melanie Smith, asked whether there was a way to create sort of an international speakers bureau across campuses. And I know that many organizations have that tool and opportunity. So Melanie, we'll be able to share some of those that you can already tap into that exist, rather than having you have to recreate the wheel, because it's a crazy time for folks to have to do that.
It'll be easier to get them now that they can use Zoom. Yeah,
that's true. We've beamed these two amazing women in from Florida, whereas I'm stuck here in dreary old Washington, D.C. So I want to thank both of you so much. This was a wonderful conversation, and hopefully gives our advisors the invitation to tell their students how much we want them in the field and how much we need them in the field, to help our country move forward, to help international affairs move forward. It's not, APSIA is not a US-centric organization, we hope. But we thank all of our attendees for being here. We hope you'll join us tomorrow as we talk about advising students about graduate school and that process. And I want to thank both Ambassador Elam-Thomas and Dr. Colón for all of their great wisdom, their leadership, and their example that they give to all of us. So thank you all.
Thank you.
And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Take care, everyone. Have a great